Haiti was practically leveled, and then the UN agencies, of course, as they like to say, and as we also like to say, swung into action. So what happened in Haiti after that is that for the next decade, if not more, in my view, Haiti was a occupied territory. Within about a year and a half, reports started to filter out about uh, what we can only and correctly describe as abuses. These were abuses that ranged from the relatively minor, which is low-level corruption, to any of the grosser ones that you can imagine, which includes pedophilia and drugs and all the rest of them. The apparatus of multilateral systems, how they work and why they work that way, in which I'd like to look at how these agencies are administered, and what does this administering actually look like. Where do these administrators come from, and who are these so-called international civil servants? And if we are still able to actually, this I'd like to do very much, but we could, depending on the discussion, we could do it in two bits, which is examining the perceptions of this, both the administration and the personnel of administration through the media that the UN generates and which is generated for the UN, which is the photography, the press coverage, the films, the videos, the events, and so on. The image of the UN is really a world by itself, which I think plays a huge role in, especially in younger people's perceptions of this UN. And I collected a few photographs, and if anybody else has also collected a few photographs, that would be nice to just have on the screen, and then we could discuss why these photographs or short videos look the way they do. And the reason I thought this would be interesting to discuss at this stage after we've done what we did yesterday is because we are still speaking about the UN, the multilateral system, and its agencies and its accompaniments as a system or as agencies. What we rarely know until you happen to be unfortunate enough to either get into it as an intern or an employee, as somebody was saying yesterday, as an intern even, or you happen to have to deal with it from the standpoint of a country negotiator. This remains a black box in a way. You know the names of the agencies, or it's like a collection of black boxes. You know the agencies and broadly what they do. What you don't know very much is how they're internally organized, and who handles that organization. And I think this is something that probably is the subject of this great topic called international relations, which I must admit I don't know much about at all. The only reason international relations a as a subject or as a domain came to my attention was because during the period of 2013 to 15, so 13, 14, and 15, I was put on one of the what are called the consultative bodies of the UNESCO Cultural Conventions. And what these consultative bodies do is that they examine what are called nominations by countries to what will become the lists of heritage, lists that are maintained by these conventions. And the people administering the movement of the consultative body, when it will meet, who will come to the meeting, what will be discussed, what the agenda is, and organizing the pile of files. I mean, just using it metaphorically like that, it was all electronic. The organizing the pile of files that would have to be read, commented upon, and then These were a group of, in every single meeting, these meetings happened in Paris, in every single meeting, these were a group of young people from Europe, all from European universities, and I would say 9 out of 10 had degrees in international relations. And that confused me because I couldn't understand, all right, you've got a degree in international relations, but do you know anything about traditional knowledge? Have you done any work in a cultural setting? Have you worked on a biopark? Whatever it is. And apparently not. So they may have had a personal interest in any of these, but that was not the criteria for them to be inducted into a UN agency. They had to have come through a formal international relations study and training with a degree. And if there was an additional certification or degree, then so much the better. So they were certainly there in order to provide the nuts and bolts, or rather to tighten the nuts and bolts of the internal administration, because their training enabled them to understand why those nuts and bolts had been created the way they had. Of course, I am relating it to you now in this way, but I didn't see it in this way at first at all. So this is still part of the internal administration, and but it also leads to, what I was saying earlier about who are the administrators, who are the international civil servants. So they, at some point, these younger lot will form an older cadre that has come through this internal training in what the nuts and bolts are, and therefore by the time that they are in a position to become, let's say, you have secretaries to conventions, treaties, and the running of the secretariat. By the time they are in a position to either become a secretary to one of these, and as you can see, there are thousands, to one of these treaties, or an assistant to a secretary, or a under secretary with a special topic, they will have a thorough knowledge of what the true currency of the UN system is. And the true currency of that UN system is actually the text of these nuts and bolts, which they become very familiar with. And in fact, I'll lead that at some stage into what I alluded to yesterday only briefly about when we were discussing this great proliferation of texts and conventions, that they enmesh the nation states in this web of obligations. So they become adept in doing this. And of course, as you can imagine, they also have the ones who graduate to the level of being secretaries of conventions, treaties, and so on, also have associate degrees or qualifications in law. So being able to wield the legal view in the drafting, not in the pursuing of obligations, in the drafting of this, is definitely an added asset. If this is the situation with UN agencies in Europe, then do we have a similar setup in India or in Asia? I couldn't see any in Asia other than in Japan and South Korea. They did, of course, have it in China. International relations. Presumably, the ones who don't make the grade for either a UN agency or another multilateral agency, or what I described as the constellation of smaller, dependent and supportive organizations that include the various, the NGOs, the INGOs, what we used to call in the earlier generation, the INGOs, the international NGOs, and now the great range of subsidiaries under, what we noted yesterday, very large foundations such as Open Society and the Gates Foundation. I suppose they are, to my mind, it looks like they are the second rung or the second tier below the UN agencies and directly the ML agencies. And the third would probably be the large national NGOs which are funded by the second tier. So there seems to be emerging a distinct career track for young people who take up IR and who may apply to the first year, and then if they don't, then they'll be caught by the net of the second and the net of the third and so on. That's what it seems to me, but I haven't given this much thought. The only reason that I spent any time at all wondering about it and asking people here, wherever in the UN system I could, is because I assume that the clerical work, and there's a lot of it, the UN is a hyper bureaucracy, that the clerical work would be done by people trained in clerical work. I couldn't see what international relations had to do with it, but obviously it has far deeper connotations, which I strongly feel need to be studied, because what we're talking about is the emergence of, as it is, as we've been seeing, the UN, even in the agencies, even in their internal processes, evade and elude accountability to the member states themselves. In which case, and not in which case, I mean, we've certainly seen it over and over again. Multilateral development banks also do. The INGOs and the second tier constellation also does. Who audits these people here? Who demands an audit? Nobody does. When you confront this in the field, and by the field I mean the field is in the UN context. The field doesn't mean that, if there's a disaster in the Kosi Valley with a flood, that is not the field. The field will then be Patna, where an administrative office, that is considered the field. So many things in the UN setting have a very different meaning compared to what we assume it should mean. So yes, what I was saying is, no, that is true. What about it attracts a certain kind of people because it is, it is a courtly setup. It is not a startup setup. That is true. On the other hand, a lot of the UN's work in the field, which relates very much to what I was saying about the perceptions that are projected at the rate of 1 million frames a day to the consuming public of the world, are about emergencies, disaster, humanitarian relief and efforts, and so on. Now, all those in fact require very quick work, very good teamwork, the willingness to be in the field as in the real field and not what the UN imagines. This is why the agencies rely on the second tier who will be there for them. If you look at it, even from the limited historicity of the UN, say the 1945 to 50 setting up period, arranging agencies, finding how to begin their great takeover of the world, we still have 60 odd years of a record of disasters, emergencies, and so on. So you would think that based only on the propaganda that is supplied endlessly by the agencies, you would think that 6 decades would be long enough for them to have evolved systems which in the defense and army sphere are called rapid response. Why does that not happen? Or where it does happen, it happens because of a national effort which then gets a UN badge put on it. Tell you what I've seen of some of these emergencies and disasters and so on. Quite soon, in fact, almost immediately after I had given a formal role in this UNESCO Cultural Conventions, the business of Haiti happened.
The climate thing.
No, the earthquake. The earthquake. So that earthquake practically leveled the islands. What happened after that? This was 2000. So when did I get into this? 2012. So this may have been 12 itself or 11.
Yeah, it was a ocean seismic thing that.
Yes. Yeah, correct. So Haiti was practically leveled, and then the UN agencies, of course, as they like to say, and as we also like to say, swung into action.
Someone needs to make a cartoon of like the UN
Swinging
agency
into
swung
action.
into
Swinging into action.
No, but I don't know if any of you have had any occasion to be interested in what happened in Haiti after that. So what happened in Haiti after that is that for the next decade, if not more, uh, in my view, Haiti was a occupied territory because every UN agency that had or could claim anything to do with disasters and emergencies was there, set up temporary offices, sent personnel there. They sent, in fact, because there was no accommodation that could be cited since it was still recovering from these things. There were landslips, landslides, all sorts of things. They went on vessels. The vessels were anchored offshore from Port-au-Prince, and they conducted their business from there. And I think within about a year and a half, reports started to filter out, certainly partly because of whatever the Haitian media was able to regroup and do their work, about what we can only and correctly describe as abuses. So these were abuses that ranged from the relatively minor, which is, low-level corruption, to any of the grosser ones that you can imagine, which includes pedophilia and drugs and all the rest of them. So who committed these abuses? It was those who were on the UN watch over there at that time and on the point. And this continued for several years until I think the mounting record of what had happened became impossible to defend. I mean, this is easily looked for if you look it up on websites and things. So it's very easy to look at this. But if you look at it as a continuum of a UN occupation of a territory following a disaster or an emergency, then that tells you a story that actually should be a very grave alarm bell for any country, any nation state that has anything to do with the UN system in any way. Once Haitian media, so far as I know, because they publish and broadcast in French, so far as I know, so whatever I heard was secondhand from French working colleagues at that time. I don't know how long it took for it to filter into French and European media after that. But I think what also did happen is because Haiti is in the American backyard. When this came out into the American press, so far as I can see, America is deeply distrustful of the UN system, which itself it propagates and supports. But I mean, at one level, I think Americans love to bash the UN, and mostly rightly so. So I think when this Haiti situation came out in American media and then was transported to US to UK via the English media, that's when at last.
Since the Haiti local news was being covered in French, is that what you said, sir? So can we, like, there would be a definite bias if something is reported from the Indian media. Was that bias toward the, in a colonized way, even in Haiti, in the way that they covered it? Did they do it in a way that UN would like?
And the response of UN towards this media reports, like how important is the media backlash for them to like course correct themselves?
Yeah, well, to what Ojasvi asked, I don't know because I didn't look at it. I just too many things to do. I didn't look at it as how is the media reporting it. But to the other part, what did the UN do when this started tumbling out? Well, as usual, they did what they do in such cases, which is oh, we are very disturbed to hear this. We'll put together a small group to go to Haiti and find out what's going on, and we'll take corrective action as soon as possible and report back to the member states. Which is, I think, is what they do and what our governments do in all such cases. So I think the more moot question is, what did the member states do once they got to know about this? Saying that, look, we also contribute to all your emergency funds, and you've sent out these planes and ships and consignments of tents and milk, food, and God knows what else. And now it turns out that this is what you use the money for. And who are these people who've employed to do this anyway, who are running around smoking drugs and being pedophiliac in nature? One would have expected member states to be asking those kind of questions, and even if you didn't ask those questions in the periodical fora, why wait for one of those to come around 2 months, 3 months hence, when you got the news and you were fairly convinced that this was in fact the case? All you had to do was simply go to your UN representative if you were a country negotiator, or if you were part of the permanent delegations to any of the UN agencies in New York or wherever else, Kenya, Nairobi, anywhere, and say, look, this is what's happening. I'm writing you a letter. If you don't want me to write a letter, then you better explain to me. I don't see why any of this couldn't have happened at any point during this whole 10-year disaster that followed the UN-sponsored, UN-directed disaster that followed the Haiti earthquake. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. I mean, they just let it roll on and on and on. One way I would say is, the UN system, or anybody who's, let's say, a country negotiator. So we have whole ranks of them, whole battalions of them, especially for the larger agencies, has to be completely focused on what his or her task is concerning that agency, and therefore, because of the number of eruptions that keep happening around the UN system in all parts of the world through the calendar year, it's possible, if I think of it, that they may have thought that, all right, something new has come out about this particular place, and it'll either die down or be solved, and it's not my direct concern. So, if you look at it that way, then it could be a failure on our part. That means, as a member country, to say that, look, we understand the UN as being some kind of moral arbiter. And if you are what you say you are, then we expect you to behave in a particular manner. And if you don't, because we're giving you money and we're giving you all kinds of other support, then we want you to correct yourself. And if you can't correct yourself, then sack the people who won't be corrected. I mean, I think that would happen in any company. But then again, this is a different planet. They love the old method. Yeah.
Okay.
So when was the old method brought into, when that there are SOPs or protocols that if an earthquake happens and if UN is intervening, a conflict arises to a point that the national government is not able to mitigate it or resolve it, so the UN peacekeeping goes in. All these protocols, all these templates, platforms that they use, what was the last time they updated all these things?
I really wouldn't know, because especially for conflict, I do not know, although one of our defense analyst buddies would be able to tell us, at one point does the UN General Assembly decide that we need to step into this conflict, or we need to be on the ground in this conflict? I mean, we meaning, as you said, the blue helmets. But in that connection, in fact, in your reading material, there's a absolutely chilling report of what happened in Katanga, Congo, many, many years ago. And that's something that I think has been brushed aside by history, and if there's some way that all the journalists among you can resurrect it, that would be a good thing. There's truly no difference. And not only no difference, I don't know whether this, I mean, I don't, I was going to say whether this is off topic or not compared to, pertaining to what we were supposed to discuss this morning, but since we're on this, I'd like to take a little of your time and tell you a few more things that I directly witnessed and to some extent had a part in 3 countries. With this UN Cultural Conventions work, some of the early countries that I had started with, which was in 2012, from late 2011, 2012. So there was that early period which there was the largely bureaucratic work of examining country nominations to UNESCO lists, heritage lists, etc. Then from late 2011, UNESCO began to do what it called a global capacity building program, which is to help countries work with these conventions better. And the early group that I worked with were Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and East Timor or Timor-Leste. Now, coincidentally, all 3 of them had recent histories of conflict, severe conflict, internal displacement, everything. And I'll just, draw for you the pictures of what that actually meant as the lingering occupation, not in the sense that what happened in Haiti, but in many ways no less damaging, I would say. So Sri Lanka, of course, the history of the IPKF and all that. But what followed after that is that Colombo became a magnet for UN agencies and what I described earlier as the second level, the second tier constellation. Again, for reconstruction, rehabilitation, and all the rest of that. When I first went to Sri Lanka, I saw this, but couldn't really make sense of it because I was far too new in this whole UN environment. When I went to East Timor, I saw it in a very, very overt manifestation. Because at that time it was still just over a decade after Timor-Leste's independence. And as usual with many of these small countries and territories, there was political instability and armed rebellion and all sorts of things happening in the country for a number of years. In fact, right through the decade of the 2000s. And there I saw the capital of Timor-Leste is Dili, and which is right on the coast. What they had done was that a little further inland, but no more than about a kilometer from the coast, they had constructed what they called a UN compound. Now, what is a UN compound? A UN compound is a very large area in which prefab dwellings or temporary structures or containerized structures are quickly built or erected. Or in some cases, the UN compound may include existing structures that have been rented from residents, but fall within a perimeter that is new. So this becomes an area in which the UN agencies set up their offices and set up their staff quarters and set up their garages, the radio and telecom centers and so on. Over time, these within about couple of years, these become enclaves by themselves, practically as if this is extraterritorial. It does not belong to us anymore. It belongs to the UN agencies, and our writ does not run here. All our laws stop at their walls. In a less overt and less ugly way, I did see it in Cambodia as well. Cambodia is another big hotspot for UN agencies. They didn't have the UN compound that I saw here, but they did have very large UN structures there. And what I saw in all 3 countries was that the immediate economic disparity that would anyway have been difficult for an ordinary resident to deal with was actually widened because of the presence of the UN agency in the form of a compound or in the form of disparate structures, but several of them, certainly far more than is warranted by any situation in the country, being placed there, and the continuous traffic between UN staffers and local vendors or merchants. To my mind, what happened here was that the immediate local economies were given this great infusion of UN staffers spending money, and that in turn caused the labor migration from neighboring regions. So, I think to me this was one of the big illustrations of how the occupying entities of the UN contributed to greater economic instability almost immediately, contributed to labor migration, contributed to rents going up, and contributed to not contributed, in fact brought in, I would call it a sort of system of domestic slavery by employing a large number of locals as, gardeners, watchmen, housekeepers, all sorts of domestic services, all sorts of mechanical services, contractors and so on, which who exerted all their efforts only to maintain the UN and its agencies there. In the short term, the result was that for any of these countries in need, the UN presence itself sucked out the able-bodied power and the spending power for itself. And in no country was I able to see, or did I see, any local organization which was able to gather itself and find the wherewithal to actually determine what was going on and say that, look, this is deeply destabilizing to us. Their mere presence here is deeply destabilizing to us. I was told both in Cambodia and in Timor-Leste that in fact the index of corruption, if you can call it that, amongst the lower levels of administration had gone up after the UN established its presence there. And I'll tell you how one direct example of how I saw this in Cambodia. Because I approached this work in the cultural field in much the same way that I approached rural development work, which was, let's find out what households are surviving on, where they are earning anything from. If they're earning through crafts and arts, let's understand where they're earning through that. Let's understand where they're spending on seasonally and through the year, where the emergencies might lie. Because, working on rural development here, we used to operate on a 4-year average. That never build a budget for what you witness over a year. Witness over 4 years, because you'll have 2 normal years and 2 bad years. 2 bad years will be a flood or a natural disaster, and the other bad year will be some calamity in the family. And those always, right from the time of, when the Planning Commission used to invite people for committees, that's the thing that we used to keep as a rule of thumb. If you budget for 1 year, you're going to get a very skewed budget. If you budget over what you see for 4 years, you will get a much more realistic picture. So I use the same rule of thumb for the cultural work in these places. And because of that, came to find out that in Cambodia, for example, this was about, would have been about 10 years ago, the average salary in the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts was in the region of around about slightly under $150. When the larger UN agencies began to set up their big offices in Cambodia, and their staff strength increased, and the traffic between them and the headquarter agency, the headquarters of their agencies went up. Changes were seen in the lifestyles and behaviors of some of the more senior officials in the ministries that had to do with UN agencies. And this came home to me, hit very hard to me one evening when one of the administrators said, "Look, we are going to go out, we have a dinner organized. I'll come to your hotel and pick you up." So I said, "Fine, I'll wait outside for you." Went down, waited, and this was in Phnom Penh, where the bulk of the traffic is, it's cycles and scooters and trishaws and, small LCVs and, of course, cars, but simple and ordinary cars. And one large Lexus pulled up at the hotel, and out jumped the administrator and said, "Get in." So surprised as I was, I got it. I thought maybe this is his boss's car or somebody's car. Certainly can't be his, but it turned out to be his. And of course, I was not indiscreet enough to ask, but I came to understand that yes, it was in fact his, and I could not imagine how, on the official salary that he had, he could afford this car. And then in subsequent visits, I realized that this was in fact quite the norm, which people piecing bits and fragments of received conversations, I came to understand that this did not exist a few years earlier when the UN imprint was not as heavy in Cambodia. To me, the correlation was clear enough. Whatever I saw, and having reflected on what I saw, I would only call it engendering corruption.
There was this change in the behavior of the seniors of UN.
The higher officials.
The higher officials, yeah.
Oh, they live at the stratospheric level of expat life. To look at all this unfold around you in several countries and look at the pattern and see, look, there is a pattern here. It's unmistakable, and this is what it points to. It was very confusing, very confusing. There won't ever be a report, and neither will there be a report from any concerned UN agency on the ground in any of these countries, nor will there be one from any of the local administrations that have to work with these UN agencies. Because quite simply, for a lot of people in these lower to middle income countries, being associated with a UN agency in whatever capacity, if you're a driver of a UN vehicle, those white UN vehicles with UN written in black or navy blue on the side. If you are a clerk in one of the UN offices, or a storekeeper, you're set for at least 10 good years. And you can take care of your family or extended family, you can send your kids to school, you can buy a car. So they don't want to rock that boat one bit. That is the local beneficiaries, who are legitimate beneficiaries, because these are paid positions, it's budgeted for, etc. But it is, this is what I was saying about contributing to economic inequality. What they would earn would be easily a multiple of 3 to 4 times what they would earn doing the same thing in the local setting. So this immediately, artificially raises wages, standard of living, etc. Whereas the demands by these newly financially empowered households cannot automatically be supplied or serviced by the town economy as it exists. So in some cases, they too get into the habit of flying abroad to buy their luxury goods and cosmetics and so on. Anyway, I mean, so that's what I meant by this whole behavioral spillover of the stratospheric expat lifestyle, which becomes I think, very aspirational to a lot of people in those situations. If I join the UN and I make use of the I'm a local and I'm vulnerable and I'm under threat, etc., those cards, and I make my way into the UN system, then I'll also be able to occupy this grand villa and have an army of servants and uh, all expenses paid lifestyle. Where I didn't have anything to do with Kenya, except that there was one of these cultural conventions meetings there in Nairobi. But of course, there it wasn't an enclave; it was more like an entire city neighborhood. Like you have a diplomatic enclave here, but it was an entire city neighborhood where these things, with offices and staff quarters, not staff quarters. I mean, these are mahals. Uh,
They would still be called staff quarters, though.
they can, of course, they are on paper. They certainly are. So then these become, the what do you call it? What are the posh areas in Goa? In Delhi, Vasant Kunj and what is it? Vasant Vihar, Vasant Enclave, and all that. So these become the equivalent, but they haven't grown organically in any way. They've just been plonked there, and the occupants have been airdropped in. So I think from an urban sociological point of view, these are like, how on earth did this happen to us in the middle of our city? Who are these people and what are they doing here? The Afghan situation is probably extreme. I would say there are few other places like that on the UN map in the world. Certainly in Central Africa, there would be a few. There too, in Kabul, there are two what are called UN compounds, which do exactly the same thing, except it's much more menacing there because you have armed battalions, in fact, protecting those compounds, and attacks do happen on those compounds. Kathmandu, there's a very fashionable area which is called Tamil. Nepal is another country which has seen UN agency presence proliferate over the years, and also the associated setting up of those tier 2 organizations that I was talking about, and one of them is called ICIMOD, International Center for Mountain Research and Development, or something like that. I can't recall the exact what the acronym expands into, but the acronym is ICIMOD, which has to do with the mountain areas of Asia. And there's also a water institute which is set up there, again a UN one. But this area called this part of Kathmandu which is called Tamil, which was became very much sought after, like the entertainment quartier of the city, with fashionable cafes, with bars, and with restaurants, with world cuisine menus, and so on. Not because the ordinary tourist to Nepal can afford it, but because these people can afford it and demand it, and they were being catered to. Let's attempt a deconstruction, however you like to call the term, of this relentless bombardment of million frames a day by the UN. So let me just go around and say, what if you look at this and you look at it as an enclosed structure which emanates a certain symbolism. What do you think it does? What kind of symbolism does it evoke? I agree with a lot of these, about the power and everything else, but I feel that to me it also represents pews and an altar. In fact, WFP, which I came to be associated with only in one place directly, which was again in Afghanistan. In fact, they are a huge presence in Afghanistan, but also just like in other places in Central Africa. I would see it as the level of the UNized food aid programs that have existed around the world for ever since the end of World War II. But except in this case, then the WFP is often the lead agency for all humanitarian work, simply because it has the largest network of actual machines to send people and packets to. So this is what they do. They're like the UN's transport contractor. Except of course where the food boxes are concerned, then this ties in with what FAO does, which has a rather more sinister aspect to it, which is what is this food in fact, and who produces it and who sends it to be utilized as food aid through the WFP. These are beautifully staged. I mean, you have to admit, we were talking about admiring the adversity the other day. Beautifully staged. Beautifully staged, because you see one helicopter has landed, another is taking off or is also landing, we don't know. Evocative of coolies at a railway station, to my mind. All well equipped with these yellow jackets, these orange jackets. I can tell you that's never the case actually. In real life, it's an absolute mob mess. It is a complete mob mess. It is, it's just like what we used to call the water markets of urban slum India. When the water tanker comes in, everybody rushes with pails and buckets and everything. It's exactly like, the reality is exactly like that.
So the Vatican has a separate seat, but the Holy See, as a religious head, has a separate seat at the UNGA as an observer. Generally, a representative of the Pope sits there, but the Pope has visited the UN 5 times or something. They keep messaging the same old crap, for lack of a better word, peacekeeping and world peace and nuclear disarmament. But they've never achieved any of that. They've never actually worked towards any of this. But it's a moral and religious obligation that the Pope has, and it comes from the history of the Vatican itself. It was formed as a seat for the Holy See because of the slipping of the power of the Christian dominion in Europe at the time and all those things. But a lot of historical, political considerations. But at the same time, it is the only religious seat at the UN. And when I discovered this and read about it, it scared me a little, because what is the implications of having a Christian seat at a place where you claim is working towards the betterment of global support, avowedly secular and all of these things, whatever. But like it's supposed to be a gathering of nation states. And then there's a religious head sitting there. So what does this mean?
This is supposed to right outside the building.
This is a flag of the Holy See as an observer. Holy See is the Pope.
Arabic happens to be part of a large part of North Africa.
Yeah.
So the entire top swath of North Africa speaks Arabic, and bits and pieces inside as well. And Africa has been. I remember this attempts were being made to drum this into my head in around 2010-11. We have these were called the UN's overarching priorities. These were the words that were used. Overarching priorities. The first of which was Africa. There were a couple of others, but in which case then Arabic would have to be included. Does this bring out the fundamental question that, look, in every single communication from UN agencies, few of them more often than the others, they talk about and repeat peace. Peace, peace, peace. I mean, peace is their overarching mantra, and yet they have arrogated to themselves the right to intervene militarily. So we will have troops, we will have tanks, we will have so and so, all these instruments of offense, where, I mean, doesn't it seem like an atrocious contradiction to you? Why I thought about doing this in the first place, which goes back to probably around 2012-13. In my early series of visits to Sri Lanka, we were in, I think we were in Kandy, no, probably Kandy area, so Central Province. And of course, my interest and the whole reason for the mission was the documentation, safeguarding of traditional crafts and art forms and so on. And we visited a village which was apparently very well known for producing beautiful, Sri Lanka has these has this tradition of mask making, which is some of it is very simple, some of it is extremely elaborate. So this village had 2 or 3 master carvers, and so we went to visit them. Lovely up in the hills, you can imagine the lush country, bananas, orchards, all the rest of it. Temples with an elephant outside or inside in the stall, and it was relatively still early years for me in the UNESCO setup, and I was looking for photographs because being in a place like this, I thought here I can find photographs with which to illustrate my report, which I would have to write at the end of this mission. And so while walking through the village, I spotted a mother with a child peering out from. So the mother was here, the child was just in front, and peering out from behind a screen door, and the screen door was nice, very nice bamboo with with a bit of paint on it, but I thought this might make a nice image. And then I had to stop myself and tell myself that I have to stop thinking as if I want to get images the way a UN photographer would. This is not what certainly I'm here for. And why I'm telling you this is to remind you or to tell you that it is so easy to slip into that, even when you have no obligation, you have no connection to do so. It is so easy because the imagery is so pervasive, it's coming at you from all angles, all sides. And when you're in that environment, you begin to feel that what you want to illustrate through the use of imagery to add to your text or your speech must conform to what the UN is already doing. And I thought that this has to be resisted somehow. Anyway, I was fortunate enough to say that, look, this is rubbish, I better stop here, not take photos like this.
So can I ask, what sort of a team does a mission typically consist of?
No, this is a small thing. So we used to have myself, like I was saying yesterday, another person who would be called an expert facilitator. We would have a representative from the local UN office. So who did we have in Sri Lanka? We didn't really have. We had somebody from the Sri Lanka National Commission, and then what is called the program officer, who would come from either the national office if it was large enough to have one, or a regional office. So Delhi is a regional office for South Asia, for Bhutan, Nepal, India, of course, and Sri Lanka. So we would have the program officer there. And then a variety of administrators from the ministries or departments that had to liaise with UNESCO as part of their mandate. So there could be 2 or 3 in Sri Lanka. At that point it was 2. There was the Ministry of Education and the Department of National Archives. So that would be the typical group that would administer this whole mission, which would last for 5 or 6 days at a time. I cannot offhand recall in any of these countries over these 10 plus years whether any of the national organizations in fact had any mind to do that or deputed anybody to do this. What in every case happened was that my reporting would go to the country authorities as well, and they would take that report and write up a summary of it and then submit it to their ministry or senior administrators. Yeah, so that's what they would do. So they would certainly, I can't really offhand recall anybody from a local ministry taking notes about what was going on. This is actually this shameless, not only shameless, but cynical credit hogging, which I noticed, I came to notice first, in fact, during what I mentioned to you, the MDGs. So this was already in the late 90s when this whole MDG sub-cult started up here. And I was still a full-time journalist until about 2003 or so. And then, in fact, I used to be with, when I came back, I was in Singapore for a few years. I worked with the Straits Times there. And then when I came back, having decided that I wanted no part of journalism anywhere anymore, to take up some of my interests which I had left behind when going to these places. And then I got interested in what returned to some, public health matters which I had left behind, and that was the first time I found out that there's this thing called MDGs, and one of the MDGs is on health. And I became associated through some old colleagues with a group which was based in Pune called Center for Communications and Development Studies, which is long since wound up. Oh yeah, absolutely. It covers everything, yeah. Center for Communications and Development Studies. So covers everything, all the bases. And one of the things that I persuaded them to undertake is, look, what is this MDGs and what is the impact of MDGs going to be on whatever sectors of whichever parts of these 8 MDGs we are doing in India, in any case as part of our national ministry programs. And that's when I slowly began to realize that the MDGs was in effect a very large umbrella that was constructed, carefully constructed at great expense by the UN to allocate, or rather to corner for itself the credit for any kind of development in these sectors which would have taken place anyway using national budgets. So, but I'd just like to go back to what you said about that UNICEF Twitter advertisement. They make it look like we did it, but whereas in fact it was the central government. But this is one of their strategies, that to find what national governments are doing and to take over whatever benefit that has been recorded and say that this benefit is due to our intervention, due to our programs, and due to our methods being adopted by the government. And what we should be asking is, why is the government sitting back and letting this credit hogging go on from under their very noses? What I find is, and particularly with this agency and certainly UNICEF also, a very dangerous agency. I've seen the messaging that comes out of different UN agencies, especially that messaging that concerns family and household, I think that needs to become a subject that has to be given careful and rigorous study. Because the impression that I form, if I have to encapsulate that impression that I had formed, is that through this messaging and through the way it constructs these programs, the programs that come out of the work that they give themselves, we have certainly a kind of assault on the family system itself. And to my mind, I haven't really, I have to say, paid much attention to UN Women as in a concerted way, what does this thing do? But to my mind, certainly there is a determined and I would say very sophisticated assault on the family as a unit, in which the female becomes an individual part and the child becomes or children become an individual part. The male is left to hang in some indeterminate hell, and these two subunits are then addressed separately. by a whole assemblage of agencies, bombarding them with messages explaining why they are different from the family and why they have to be treated, and their whole categorization of rights is then supplied. I think this really deserves a lot of study, which I'm not sure whether it has started or been done or attempted. I really don't know. But if these agencies are doing that, and I feel quite sure that they are, I know that UNICEF is doing that with children in very subtle, sophisticated, and sinister ways. Alliteration, part of which I attempted to do in that long report which you have in your electronic folders on Cambodia, but which, I mean, the writing of that report itself was a struggle between three agencies, UNESCO, struggle for me with three agencies, UNESCO, UNICEF, and the Ministry of Education of Cambodia itself, which did their best to reduce, dampen, and tone down the critical parts of the report, because they did not want me to say that the curriculum, the report is about the mainstream, so-called mainstreaming of cultural heritage training and approaches into the education system. And they did not want me to say that fundamentally, that if at all you want to do mainstreaming, you have to do it by thinking about it yourself, and don't blindly adopt or import what both UNESCO and UNICEF are telling you on the one hand about cultural heritage, on the other hand about your education. They did not want this said explicitly, and it took about 6 months of struggle before that came out. It came out with that part missing. What they would do is, so this document would be in this docx format, and then there would be comments on the side. And those comments would be, perhaps we can include a mention about something which happened to be either UNICEF program or a Ministry of Education, Government of Cambodia program under the supervision of UNICEF, which in fact was, which if we mentioned, it would be a mentioning of the opposite to what I was saying. So I was expected to read that and understand that, look, this is the part that if you are going to mention this, if you are going to continue to persist in wanting to mention this, then we have ways to make you think.
So it was all essentially like a covert instruction.
Yeah, very much. Whoever, whichever program officers were deputed to look after this particular project. But I knew I could make out from my own direct communication emails with them that they were simply mouthpieces. They were relaying it further up. There's another organization which is which is one of those little known ones in the whole UN system, and that is called ECOSOC. Yeah, the Economic and Social Council, which actually is very powerful. But it is like a concealed power, and these are the fellows who, so they're in some dimly lit vast cathedral somewhere which is unseen by mundane mortals like me. But at times I was reminded of their imperial presence when resolutions and notations and things like that from the ECOSOC were sent to me saying, look, we have to include this in our mission agenda, or you have to include this in your mission report, and you are expected to simply do it. So who is this ECOSOC, and what are they meant to do, and where does their power reach, and how do they, as a not a frontline agency, but I think a kind of controlling entity behind some of the major frontline entities, how are they seen by the nation states is something that I don't know whether anybody has even gotten to. Yeah.
So do they do anything related to economics or social?
Oh, certainly, yeah. There's another outfit which is UNRISD, United Nations Research Institute on Social Development. On the surface, it looks like
Very innocent name.
yeah, it looks like a sort of dharamshala for jaded leftists from all over the world. But in fact, what they're told to do is to provide the position papers, which then legitimize a lot of the programs that the ECOSOC then dishes out to the other agencies, saying, "Look, we have the social background, or rather the social engineering background with which to justify this." That's how it seems to me.